What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? Frank Delaney sat at the edge of his kitchen table, staring into a lukewarm cup of coffee. It had cooled during the last commercial break, though he hadn't really noticed. The TV hummed in the background, a morning show host chirping about a celebrity's skincare routine. Frank didn't care. He hadn't cared for a long time. Behind him, the old clock ticked. The dog, Moose, let out a low, tired groan from under the table. It was a cold October morning in Ohio, and everything in Frank's world felt just as gray as the sky. His granddaughter Haley sat across from him, headphones in, eyes locked to her phone screen, thumbs moving so fast they blurred. She was 13 and practically lived in another universe, one with usernames and streaming and emojis Frank could barely understand. She didn't look up once. "Morning," Frank said anyway. No response. He stirred his coffee, even though there was nothing left to mix. A part of him wondered when exactly things had started to feel like this, quiet, heavy, irrelevant. Maybe it was when Mary died, 5 years ago. Maybe it was when Josh stopped calling. Or maybe, if he was being honest, it was when he retired from teaching shop class and nobody ever asked him for help again. People used to need him. He was good with his hands, good with wood, good with fixing things. Now, most days, he couldn't even fix a conversation. Moose sneezed. Frank reached down and gave the dog a lazy scratch behind the ears. "Still with me, huh, boy?" he whispered. Moose thumped his tail once against the floor. Outside, the wind pushed dead leaves across the driveway. The garage stood quiet, shuttered like a tomb. For years, Frank had told himself he'd get around to organizing it. Clean up the old workbench, maybe even finish the wooden airplane model he and Josh had started back when Josh was 16. That was over 30 years ago now. The project had stopped when Josh did. When they argued about college, about the future, about everything. Josh wanted computers. Frank wanted wood. Neither one budged. And the plane never flew. Frank stood up slowly, knees cracking in protest, and wandered to the living room. The remote felt heavy in his hand, but not as heavy as the silence. He flipped through channels until he landed on something familiar, a podcast playing on a local access channel. Joe Rogan's voice filled the room, and there he was, Elon Musk, sitting with that faraway look in his eyes, talking about rockets and Mars and ideas that sounded like science fiction. Frank usually rolled his eyes at these kinds of things. Billionaires talking big. But today, something about Musk's voice caught him. "If something matters," Elon said, "age is irrelevant. Build anyway." Frank froze. He didn't know why that line hit him like it did, but it landed square in his chest, like a nail driven by a hammer. He hit rewind. Played it again. "If something matters, age is irrelevant. Build anyway." Frank leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The way Elon said it, it wasn't pep talk. It was a challenge. Build anyway. The words echoed in his head like they'd been waiting for years to show up. Haley walked past him without saying a word, backpack slung over one shoulder. She didn't even glance at the screen. But Frank's eyes didn't leave it. "Build anyway," he whispered. He stood slowly, his joints aching, but he didn't sit back down. Instead, he crossed to the hallway, reached for the dusty key that hung on a hook by the back door, and stepped into the garage for the first time in almost a year. It smelled like old wood and regret. Cobwebs hung like curtains across forgotten shelves. The workbench was still there, buried under a mountain of clutter, rusted pliers, bent nails, a tin can of brushes stiff with dried paint. And there, against the far wall, lay the half-built airplane model. Dusty. Broken. But still there. Frank walked over, heart beating just a little faster. He touched the wing, brushed off the dust with trembling fingers. It was cedar, hand-carved. They'd worked on it together, he and Josh. He remembered the way Josh's eyes lit up when they got the tailpiece right. The way they argued over the propeller design. The way they laughed. That laugh hadn't lived in this garage for 3 decades. Frank stood there for a long time, his hand resting on that wing. Then he turned and grabbed a broom. He swept slowly, methodically, clearing a path to the bench. He tossed out old junk, wiped down the table, dug through drawers until he found a pair of safety glasses and a square of sandpaper. He sat down. The stool groaned under his weight. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up a small wooden dowel and began to sand it. He didn't care that it hurt. He didn't care that it was slow. He sanded anyway. Outside, the wind kept blowing. Inside, the air began to shift. Frank worked in silence for almost an hour. Not because he had to. Not even because he believed he could finish the plane. But because, for the first time in years, something inside him had stirred. A fire, faint but real. Build anyway. He didn't even notice Haley standing in the doorway until she spoke. "What's that?" Frank looked up, startled. "It's an old project. From when your dad was your age." Haley tilted her head. "Cool." She stood there for a beat, then disappeared back into the house. Frank smiled, just barely. He reached for a pencil, made a note on the old blueprint, and muttered to himself, "Let's see if this old bird can still fly." That night, after dinner, Frank opened a new notebook and wrote the date at the top. He scribbled a single sentence, "I was 67 and felt useless. Then I picked up one piece of wood." He went to bed tired but full, the way a man sleeps after putting his hands to something real. Moose curled up beside him. The podcast still echoed in his ears. Build anyway. It wasn't a slogan. It was a dare. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank Delaney had once been a man people came to for answers. Kids at school used to line up outside his shop room with broken projects and hopeful eyes. There was something about working with your hands. Feeling the weight of a hammer, the grain of fresh pine, the satisfaction of a piece fitting just right. Frank wasn't much for speeches, but he believed in finish lines. In effort. In craftsmanship. And once upon a time, people respected that. Once upon a time, Frank felt like he mattered. That version of him was gone now, buried under time, routine, and the silent weight of days that all felt the same. He hadn't always felt useless. There were years, decades, even, when life had purpose. His career, though modest, had meaning. He taught shop for 38 years at a public high school in western Ohio. He loved the kids, even the troublemakers. Maybe especially them. He knew what it meant to be underestimated. Frank had been raised by a father who didn't believe in softness, who thought books were for fools and feelings were for women. Frank had learned early to be quiet, to work hard, and to never expect anyone to cheer you on. But Mary had changed that. Mary, with her soft laugh and her practical shoes, had come into his life like spring after a brutal winter. They met at a hardware store. She was buying paint, he was buying nails. He dropped something, she picked it up, and he offered to carry her bags. She told him no thanks, she was perfectly capable, but she let him walk her to her car anyway. 3 months later they were married. They bought a little house just outside of town, one with a half-acre backyard and an old detached garage that would become Frank's workshop. They raised Josh there. Built a life full of the kind of love that doesn't make headlines but holds firm during storms. Josh was always different. Smart in a way Frank didn't quite understand. More books than wrenches. Always asking, why, instead of just doing. At first Frank thought it was stubbornness. Later he realized it was curiosity. Mary saw it first. He's got your brain, she told Frank one night after Josh had taken apart the toaster and turned it into a pencil sharpener. Frank grunted. "I never needed a pencil sharpener that runs on AC." Mary smiled. "Maybe that's the point." Still, Frank tried. He taught Josh to sand, to cut, to measure twice. They built a birdhouse. Then a stool. Then a wooden model airplane. That last one, Frank could still see it in his mind, was never finished. Not because they ran out of time, but because they ran out of each other. Josh went off to college in Boston. Got into computers. Coding. Started talking about startups and venture capital and things Frank didn't understand. Their phone calls got shorter. Holidays got quieter. The garage grew colder. And Frank, who had always believed you could fix anything with the right tools, found himself helpless when it came to his own son. The last time they really spoke, really fought, was over dinner. Thanksgiving. Mary had made stuffing from scratch. Josh said something about how Frank didn't understand the future. Frank said something about respect. Josh slammed a door. Frank slammed a drawer. Mary cried quietly in the kitchen. That was 15 years ago. After that, things came in polite emails and strained phone calls. Then fewer of those. Then none. And then Mary got sick. It started with fatigue. Then weight loss. Then appointments. Then quiet drives home. Frank watched her disappear a little more each day. He tried to help. She smiled through it. Always the stronger one. Even at the end, when her hands were too weak to lift a spoon, she whispered to him, "It's okay, Frank. You built a good life." But Frank didn't believe it. He didn't feel good. Or strong. Or useful. Not anymore. After she passed, the house became a museum. Frank moved through it like a ghost, touching things but never changing them. Her apron still hung on the hook in the kitchen. Her teacup still sat on the second shelf. He couldn't bring himself to move any of it. What was the point? The school gave him a party when he retired. Sheet cake, punch, a plaque with a gold plate. Mr. Delaney, shop teacher, 1978 to 2016. He smiled for pictures. Shook hands. Went home. The next morning, he slept until 9 and realized no one needed him to be anywhere ever again. That first year was hard. The second was worse. Time, they said, healed. But for Frank, time just layered more silence on top of what was already broken. He started forgetting what day it was. Moose became his only real company. Haley would come over sometimes, but she was a teenager now, eyes in a screen, ears covered in headphones, lost in some digital world where old men like Frank didn't exist. He understood. He didn't blame her. It just stung, that's all. Like everything else. He spent a lot of time in his recliner, staring out the window, wondering when exactly he stopped being a person with stories to tell and started being background noise. He had a neighbor, George, who used to stop by. They'd drink beer and talk about old trucks. George had a stroke 2 years ago and moved in with his daughter in Florida. Frank thought about calling sometimes, but what would he say? "Hey, I'm still alive." It felt pathetic. It all felt pathetic. Until that morning, when he heard Elon Musk say, "Build anyway." Until that sentence reached into his soul and shook something loose. Because suddenly Frank remembered something he hadn't thought about in years, the smell of sawdust in summer. The way Josh had once said, "This wing's gonna fly, Dad. Just wait." The way Mary had said, "You always do better when you've got something in your hands." And Frank realized maybe that was the problem. He hadn't held anything in his hands for too long. Not anything that mattered. Not anything he built. The world had changed, sure. People flew drones and built things with code now. But the human heart didn't evolve that fast. The need to create, to make something real, to finish something that began long ago, that was still there. Still waiting. That's why, when he touched that wing again for the first time in 30 years, it felt like meeting a version of himself he'd buried. The version that wasn't done yet. The version that still had something to say. That night, as he stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind push dead leaves across the roof, Frank didn't feel fixed. He didn't feel young. But he felt awake. And that, for the first time in years, was enough. In the morning, he would clean the bench. He would oil the tools. He would sort through the plans. One nail at a time. 1 hour a day. That was the plan. Not for anyone else. Not for likes or clicks or followers. For himself. Because if something matters, age is irrelevant. And maybe that plane wasn't just wood and glue. Maybe it was a bridge back to the boy he'd lost, the woman he missed, and the man he used to be. Maybe, just maybe, it was the one thing he needed to build so everything else could begin again. Frank didn't sleep well after that first day in the garage. His body ached in new places, his joints stiff like rusted hinges. He'd only worked for a little over an hour, just enough to sand one dowel and clear a corner of the bench, but it felt like he'd run a marathon. At 3:22 a.m., he found himself sitting at the kitchen table with a heating pad draped across his shoulders and a glass of warm milk he didn't want. The house was dark and quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the wooden floorboards settling, like the place itself was remembering it used to be alive. His eyes scanned the room as if expecting Mary to walk in, rub his shoulders, and ask what was keeping him up. But the only thing that greeted him was silence and the ever-present weight of time. It was that strange hour of the night when your regrets speak loudest and the good memories feel like they belong to someone else. Frank thought about calling Josh again, maybe even apologizing. But he didn't have the right words. What would he even say? Sorry I was too stubborn. Sorry I didn't understand you. Sorry I let 30 years pile up between us like sawdust. The words stayed inside, where they always did. Around 5 a.m., he dozed off in the chair. When he woke up, sunlight had begun to seep through the curtains, and Moose was sniffing around his feet, eager for his morning walk. Frank pushed himself up slowly, grabbing the edge of the table for balance, and made his way to the hallway mirror. He looked older than he remembered. Paler. Smaller somehow. The man who used to carry 2x4s on his shoulder like they were nothing now needed a handrail just to get into the tub. This is what useless looks like, he muttered. Then, without even knowing why, he said out loud, is it too late? He hated how small his voice sounded. Like he didn't expect an answer. He fed Moose, put on a flannel shirt with one button missing, and stepped into the cold morning. The garage still looked like a tomb, but something had changed. The broom leaned against the wall where he left it. The blueprint was spread out neatly on the bench. The dowel, half sanded, waited patiently like a job not yet abandoned. He walked in, flicked on the overhead light, and exhaled deeply. Okay, he said to no one, let's try this again. For the next week, he returned to the garage every day. Just an hour at a time. No pressure. No expectations. He measured, he sanded, he reread the notes he and Josh had scribbled in the margins of the old plans. Some of the parts were still usable. Some were warped with age. He'd have to cut new ones. That was fine. It gave him purpose. Haley peeked in one afternoon while he was shaping a new rudder. What is it? She asked. Frank looked up, surprised. It's a plane. A model. Your dad and I started it a long time ago. She looked genuinely curious, and it surprised him. Does it fly? Frank shook his head. Not really. It was more about the building. She nodded. Cool, she said. Then walked away. Just like that. But for the first time, her voice didn't sound like obligation. It sounded like interest. That same night, Frank was watching a video on his phone, an old Elon Musk interview from years ago. The host had asked him what kept him going when things were hard, when SpaceX rockets failed, when Tesla nearly went bankrupt. Elon's response was simple. "I look at the future I want," he said, "and I ask myself if I'm helping it happen." Frank paused the video. The words hung in the air. He picked up his journal and wrote, "Am I helping my future happen? Or just watching it disappear?" The next morning, Frank had a follow-up appointment with his doctor. Dr. Bishop was a kind man in his 40s with a nervous smile and a habit of looking at his computer more than his patient. After the usual checks and taps and charts, Dr. Bishop sat back and said, "Your numbers are stable, Frank. That's good. But I want you to think about pacing yourself. Your knees are under more pressure. And you've got early arthritis setting into your hands." Frank gave a slow nod. "I've been working in my garage again." The doctor looked up. "Doing what?" "Finishing a model plane I started with my son a long time ago." Dr. Bishop gave a neutral smile, the kind that meant well but didn't mean much. "That's nice. Just make sure you don't overdo it. Maybe leave the heavy lifting to someone younger." Frank didn't respond. He left the office with the vague taste of condescension in his mouth. He knew the doctor meant no harm. But the words stayed with him all day. Leave it to someone younger. He chewed on that line like it was a piece of gristle. That evening, Haley showed him how to use TikTok. It took about 5 tries and 2 password resets, but eventually he had an account at Garage 67. Haley filmed a short clip of him sanding a wooden piece, then added some music and a caption, 6-7 and still building. He figured maybe 2 people would see it. The next morning it had 87 views. The next day, it had 400. Comments started appearing, "Reminds me of my grandpa. You're an inspiration, sir. This makes me want to finish my own project." Frank blinked at the screen. He didn't even know what to say. "People are watching this?" he asked Haley. She nodded. "Yeah. They love you." Frank chuckled. "Well, I'll be damned." That night, he didn't sleep much again. But this time, it wasn't pain or regret keeping him up. It was something else. Energy. Possibility. Hope, maybe. The next day in the garage, something strange happened. He hit a problem. One of the original pieces he and Josh had cut years ago didn't fit with the new wing structure. His first instinct was to curse, to toss it aside and give up for the day. But then he stopped. He took a breath. He sketched a workaround. He shaved the edge. He tested the fit. It held. He whispered to himself, "Adapt or give up. Not both." That night, he added a new quote to the wall of the garage, just beneath Elon's, "Build what's still possible." A few days later, Frank found himself at the grocery store when a woman his age approached him. "Are you the garage guy?" she asked, smiling. "My grandson showed me your video." Frank blinked. "I guess I am." "You made me cry," she said. "Thank you for reminding me it's not too late." Frank smiled. That night, he opened his journal again. Wrote just 4 words, "People are watching again." But it wasn't just about being seen. It was about being useful. Relevant. Needed. Frank wasn't sure what exactly was happening, but he felt something rising in him again. A quiet war between the voice that said, "You're too old," and the one that whispered, "You're not done." Most days, the second voice was winning. Barely. But that was enough. Every nail he hammered, every comment he read, every piece he fit together felt like a small act of rebellion against time, against invisibility, against the lie that said your best years had to be behind you. Frank still didn't know if the plane would ever fly. But he was starting to feel like maybe he could. Frank had spent most of his adult life avoiding things that felt uncertain. In his world, certainty was safety. You measured twice. You cut once. You double-checked the plan before lifting a tool. There was comfort in knowing what came next. But now, everything that mattered seemed to come from not knowing. He didn't know if the plane would hold together. He didn't know if Josh would ever see what he was doing. He didn't know if his body would let him finish what he started. But he picked up the chisel anyway. That was the change. A small one. But everything in his world shifted because of it. He was used to sitting through the day waiting for it to be over. Now, he caught himself glancing at the clock in anticipation. He'd clean the kitchen faster. Fold the laundry earlier. Even walked moose around the block without the usual dragging of feet. All so he could get to the garage and keep building. That hour in the garage had become a lifeline, a ritual, a statement. He didn't realize how powerful that small shift had been until one afternoon when Haley brought him a sandwich and sat on the stool next to him while he worked. She was chewing gum, scrolling through her phone with one hand, and watching him with the other. "Do you think my dad remembers this?" she asked, out of nowhere. Frank paused, one hand on the clamp, his thumb still pressed against the wing's edge. "The plane?" "Yeah," she said. "Did he like working on it?" Frank stared at the unfinished propeller. "He used to get excited about it. Used to tell me he wanted to make a real one someday. Not just a model. A plane that could really fly. He's in Seattle now, right?" "Yeah," Frank said, keeping his voice neutral. "Tech stuff. Coding. Some company that makes apps." Haley was quiet for a moment. "Do you miss him?" Frank's grip on the clamp tightened. "Every day." She nodded, then tucked her phone into her hoodie pocket. "I think he misses you too." Frank swallowed hard. "Maybe." She didn't push. Just sat there while he glued the last piece of the tail assembly in place. When it was finished, she picked up her phone again and said, "Wanna film another one?" Frank looked at her, a little surprised. "Now?" "Yeah," she said. "This is the cool part. You're making stuff happen." She filmed a short clip of him holding the finished tail, and then she added text, "Week 2. Piece by piece. You're never too old to build again." She posted it. They went inside. By dinner, the video had over 1,000 views. A man in Maine commented, "My wife passed last year. Your story got me back in the garden. Thank you." A woman in Texas wrote, "I'm 72 and started painting again. You reminded me I'm still allowed to dream." Frank read each comment twice. Then 3 times. Something lit up in him that had nothing to do with likes or fame. It was connection. Someone out there was watching and remembering who they used to be, just like he was. That night, Frank sat at the kitchen table with his notebook and wrote, "Maybe it's not the size of the change that matters. Maybe it's just deciding to care again." The next day, he put on his oldest denim jacket, the one Mary had always said made him look like Paul Newman, and drove to the hardware store for the first time in months. The drive felt surreal. Like stepping back into a world that had long since gone on without him. The automatic doors hissed open, and the smell of fresh lumber and sawdust hit him like a memory. He wandered the aisles slowly, touching things. New sandpaper, fresh clamps, a bottle of glue. The cashier, a teenage boy with headphones around his neck, looked at him and said, "Hey, wait, are you the guy on TikTok? The garage guy?" Frank chuckled. "Yeah. I guess I am. My grandpa watches you. He sent me your video." Frank's eyes widened slightly. "Tell him I said thank you." The boy grinned and rang up the items. Frank walked out of the store with a paper bag full of tools and a chest full of warmth. He wasn't invisible anymore. That afternoon, while sanding a new wing rib, Frank thought about what Elon Musk had said in another video Haley had shown him: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. The words had settled in his brain like a compass. He'd spent too long living like odds were all that mattered. Like effort only counted if you were guaranteed a win. But here he was, building a plane that would never fly, at least not literally. And somehow it meant more than anything he'd done in years. That night, after Moose was fed and Haley had gone home, Frank sat at his dining room table, staring at the empty seat across from him. Mary would have been proud. He could almost hear her voice, "Told you that garage would save you someday." He smiled at the thought. He went to the drawer, pulled out a yellowed envelope, and unfolded one of the last letters Mary had written him, months before she passed. In it, she'd written, "I hope when I'm gone, you don't let the silence win. I hope you keep making things. That's when you're most alive." Frank read it twice, then folded it carefully and returned it to its place. He stood, walked to the hallway, and pulled a dusty wooden frame from the closet. It held an old photo of him and Josh in the garage, Frank in flannel, Josh wearing a baseball cap backwards, both of them holding the unfinished wing like it was a treasure. He wiped off the dust and carried it into the garage. He hung it above the bench. "There," he said softly. "We're back." The next morning, Frank woke up with more energy than usual. He brewed coffee, fed Moose, and spent 20 minutes writing in his journal. Then he got to work on the rudder assembly, which required precise angles and measurements. It took him 2 hours, and he had to redo one part twice. But when he stepped back and saw it in place, he felt a quiet kind of joy, steady, humble, real. That afternoon, he received a text message. He barely used the phone, but Haley had set him up with voice-to-text. The message read, "Saw your video. Looks like the old garage is alive again. Josh." Frank stared at the screen. "Read it again." The words blurred a little, like the light had shifted. He didn't respond right away. Just stared at it, hand over his heart. The plane wasn't finished. The relationship wasn't repaired. But something had shifted. It wasn't just wood and glue anymore. It was healing. It was history. It was hope in the form of splinters and sawdust. That night, he wrote in his journal, "The world doesn't change all at once. It changes the moment you do one thing differently." He underlined it twice. Frank sat in the garage that Saturday morning as the sun broke through the frosted windows, making long streaks of gold across the cement floor. He had the tail section clamped into place, the wing brackets laid out neatly beside him, and a quiet focus behind his eyes that hadn't been there in years. He didn't rush. Every cut, every sanding stroke, was careful. Intentional. And somehow, through all the tiny aches and groans of his aging body, he felt more alive than he had in decades. He had lost count of the days now, days since he started working again, days since Haley had filmed the first video, days since Josh's unexpected text message. That message still lived in his chest like a lit candle. Small, but warm. He hadn't answered it. Not yet. Part of him didn't want to scare it away. The plane was taking shape. Not just in wood and glue, but in meaning. In memory. In redemption. The old blueprint was covered in new notes now, scribbled in Frank's messy all-caps handwriting, "Reinforced joint here. Tail angle was wrong, adjust by 3 degrees. And one note, circled twice, finish what matters." Outside, the trees were beginning to turn. Reds and golds bleeding through green, like the world itself was shifting alongside him. Autumn had always been Mary's favorite. "It smells like change," she used to say as she pulled out the pumpkin bread pans. Frank could almost hear her voice, soft and bright in the back of his mind, and it made his hands tremble just a little. That morning, Haley showed up earlier than usual. She had a milkshake in one hand and a ring light tucked under her other arm. "Today's the big one," she said. Frank looked up from his workbench. Big what? It's week 4. We've got over 70,000 followers. People are waiting to see your update. 70,000. Frank blinked, stunned. What the heck do 70,000 people want with me? You, she said, setting up the light, are reminding them it's not over. She helped him set the frame, adjust the camera, and even dabbed a little sawdust off his cheek with a tissue. Look into the camera, she said. Tell them where you're at. Frank cleared his throat. Looked into the phone's glass eye. I was 67, he began slowly, and I thought I was finished. I thought the best parts of life were behind me. I stopped building. I stopped reaching out. I stopped believing. He paused. His voice cracked a little, but he didn't stop. But then I heard a man say something. Elon Musk, he said, build anyway. Those 2 words brought me back in here. I picked up a piece of wood. I started over. And now, well, we're almost done. He held up the completed tail section. I'm not who I used to be. But I'm not gone yet. Haley clapped. That was awesome. Frank exhaled. God, I hope I didn't sound like a Hallmark movie. She uploaded the video. Within an hour, comments poured in. This hit me right in the chest. Started crying at my desk. Thank you, sir. How do I send this to my dad? He needs to see this. Frank scrolled through them slowly, eyes wide with disbelief. It wasn't about the attention. It was the proof that he hadn't disappeared, that his voice still held weight. That he could matter. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly overhead, he thought about Josh's text again. Saw your video. Looks like the old garage is alive again. Frank hadn't written back, and he wasn't sure why. Maybe pride. Maybe fear. What if Josh was only reaching out of politeness? What if he wasn't ready? What if they weren't? But then another thought came, like a whisper from somewhere deeper. What if this is your shot? He got up. Walked to the desk. Sat down and opened a new email. It took him 20 minutes to write 3 sentences. Then he deleted them. Started again. Then again. Finally, he typed. Hi, Josh. I'm building the plane again. The one we started. It's almost finished. I'd like you to see it when you're ready. Dad. He hovered over the send button for a long time. Then, with a deep breath, he clicked. The next day he didn't check his inbox at all. He buried himself in finishing the propeller assembly. It was delicate work, tiny cuts, exact measurements, slow sanding. He played jazz from the old speaker in the corner, the same station he and Mary used to dance to on Sunday mornings. He found himself humming along. Haley brought lunch, snapped a few behind-the-scenes photos, and posted a caption, "He's rebuilding more than a plane. He's rebuilding his life." Frank chuckled when she showed it to him. "You should be a writer." "Maybe I will," she said. "If TikTok doesn't make me famous first." The video went viral overnight. Over 1 million views. People began messaging her asking how they could support Frank. One woman offered to send him tools. A retired Air Force pilot offered to build a launch stand for display. Frank was stunned. All this, from sanding a wing. Not the wing, Haley said. The choice. People aren't watching a plane. They're watching you choose to keep going. That hit him hard. That night, he opened his email and saw it. A reply from Josh. Just one line. "I booked a flight. I want to see it too." Frank's heart dropped to his knees. He read the sentence again. And again. He stood up, walked to the garage, and stared at the plane under the work light. It still needed polish. Still needed the propeller mounted. But it was real. It was almost there. And now, so was Josh. The next 2 days passed in a blur. He barely slept. Haley helped him clean the garage from top to bottom. They cleared shelves, dusted off old tools, polished the workbench until it gleamed. Frank even pulled out a picture of Mary and set it on the shelf above the plane. "You should be here too," he whispered. When Josh arrived, Frank was standing in the driveway, hands in his jacket pockets, Moose sitting patiently at his feet. Josh stepped out of the rideshare car slowly, a backpack over one shoulder, looking older than Frank remembered but with the same curious eyes. "Hey," Josh said. "Hey," Frank replied. They stared at each other for a beat too long. Then Frank stepped forward and hugged him. Josh didn't hesitate. The hug was stiff at first, but then something broke open. They held on. Tight. When they let go, Frank nodded toward the garage. "Come on. I want to show you." They walked in together. Josh looked around slowly, like he was in a museum of his own childhood. His eyes landed on the plane. He stopped. "That's really it," he said. "You finished it." Frank smiled. "Almost. Thought maybe we'd finish the propeller together." Josh smiled, eyes glassy. "Yeah. I'd like that." They worked for an hour. Just like old times. Fitting, sanding, adjusting. No arguments. No shouting. Just the quiet rhythm of hands working toward a shared goal. When the propeller was mounted, they both stepped back. Frank reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the little metal plaque he'd had engraved the day before. He handed it to Josh. It read, "Delaney Model 1, 1989 to 2025, built anyway." Josh blinked hard. "You kept going." "We both did," Frank said. They mounted the plaque on the base together. The moment held, golden and still, like something sacred. That night, Frank sat on the porch while Josh tucked Haley in. He looked up at the stars. The wind was cool but gentle. The house behind him glowed with laughter and warmth. He thought of Elon Musk again, not the billionaire, not the rockets, but the idea. The mindset. That one stubborn refusal to accept limits. That voice that said, "Build anyway." He smiled to himself. He had broken through. Not just the silence. Not just the guilt. But the fear that he was already finished. He was still building. Still becoming. Still here. Frank never believed in perfect moments. Life, he'd always said, wasn't a movie, it was sawdust and coffee stains, unfinished projects, and people saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. But that Sunday morning, something came close. He stood in the center of the garage with Josh on one side, Haley on the other, and the completed model plane gleaming on its wooden stand like a monument to something far bigger than craftsmanship. The sun spilled in through the windows just right, catching the polished propeller and scattering light across the bench like sparks. Mary's photo sat just above, watching it all. And for the first time in years, Frank felt full. Not the kind of full that comes from a big dinner or a polite compliment, but the kind that settles into your bones, the kind that says, "This matters." They didn't say much that morning. Josh had a flight in the afternoon, and Haley was making pancakes inside. Frank poured 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to his son. "Never thought we'd get here," Josh said, running a finger along the wing's smooth edge. "Me neither," Frank replied. "But I'm glad we did." Josh smiled. "You know, when I was a kid, I didn't care if it flew. I just liked building it with you." Frank's throat tightened. He looked down, then out the window. "I should have held on to that. I let too many years pass thinking the plane was what mattered." "It still matters," Josh said, "but not as much as this." Frank looked at him. "This?" "Us," Josh said. "Being here. Still trying." Frank didn't have a reply, just a nod. They stood in silence, sipping coffee, the hum of the world going on around them. A car passed on the road. A lawnmower buzzed somewhere in the distance. But in that garage, time seemed to pause. Frank wasn't thinking about being 67. He wasn't thinking about arthritis or missed calls or how many days he had left. He was thinking about now. About what was still possible. Later that afternoon, after Josh left for the airport, Frank sat alone in the garage for a long time. He didn't cry, though something inside him softened. He just stared at the plane. He remembered the first time he held the blueprint, back when Josh was 10 and full of dreams, and Frank still thought being a good father meant keeping a roof over their heads, not showing up at the science fair or building paper rockets. He wished he'd known better then. But maybe this was what redemption looked like, not erasing the mistakes, but building something honest in their place. That evening, Haley sat with him on the porch, 2 mugs of cocoa between them. "You know," she said, "a guy from YouTube messaged me. Wants to do a segment on your story." Frank raised an eyebrow. "My story?" "Yeah," she said, grinning. "You're kind of a thing now. Grandpa goes viral. You've got people following every video. There's even fan art. Someone made a watercolor of you and the plane." Frank laughed, almost choking on his cocoa. "Fan art? What the hell for?" Haley showed him the image on her phone. It was stylized, a little exaggerated, but beautiful. The expression on his face was serene, focused. Powerful. "Is that supposed to be me?" he asked. "Yep. That's you, Grandpa Frank, builder of dreams." He shook his head, but he was smiling. That night, as he lay in bed, he opened his notebook and began to write, not notes, not sketches, but a letter. A long one. To Josh. He told him things he should have said years ago. About how proud he was. About how wrong he'd been to stay silent when things got hard. About how the plane saved him. About how Elon's words, "build anyway," kept him going when he wanted to quit. He told him he loved him. Then he folded the letter, placed it inside a small envelope, and set it on the shelf next to the plaque. In the coming days, Frank's story spread further. He did a Zoom interview with a podcast called Second Acts, and they titled the episode, "The Man Who Built His Way Back." The comments were overwhelming. People from everywhere, Texas, Ohio, Canada, even New Zealand, sent messages about how they'd started building again. One woman, aged 79, sent a photo of a rocking chair she was carving. "You reminded me I still have hands that can create," she wrote. Frank printed that one out and tacked it to the garage wall. A man from Florida posted a video with the hashtag #Garage67, showing off a boat he was restoring with his granddaughter. Another man wrote, "I watched my dad disappear after my mom died. Your story brought him back to his workbench. Thank you, Frank." The whole thing felt unreal. But it was real. Haley helped him keep up with the messages, and one day she handed him a box of letters. "These are the ones that came by mail," she said. "Thought you might want to read them the old-fashioned way." Frank sat at the dining room table for hours, going through them one by one. Some were from veterans. Some from widows. Some from people who hadn't touched a project in 20 years. And all of them said the same thing in different ways: "You made me believe again." One envelope had no return address. Inside was a single sheet with a printed quote from Elon Musk. "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Beneath it, in neat handwriting: "You did it, Frank. Now we will too." Frank put that one on the fridge. A few weeks later, the mayor's office called. They wanted to honor Frank at the town's annual Fall Fest, a local tradition of pie contests and high school bands. "You've brought something special to this town," the mayor said. "You've reminded people what perseverance looks like. Frank agreed, reluctantly. He wasn't used to attention. But Haley insisted, and by then, he was learning to trust the momentum. On the day of the festival, the plane was wheeled onto the community center stage. A small plaque stood beside it, telling its story. People took pictures. Kids asked questions. One man leaned close and said, "You've given me the guts to call my son. We haven't spoken in 8 years. I'm making that call tonight." Frank nodded, too moved to speak. When they handed him the microphone, he paused before talking. The crowd was quiet. The wind rustled a few leaves across the stage. "I don't have much to say," he began, his voice clear. "Just this, if you're waiting for a perfect time to start over, it won't come. Start anyway. I was 67 and thought I was done. I thought life had passed me by. Then I changed one thing. I started building again. Not just this plane, but something inside me. Something I thought I'd lost. It wasn't easy. It hurt sometimes. But the work saved me." He held up a photo of him and Josh with the finished plane. "This is the legacy. Not the wood. Not the views online. But the connection. The courage to keep trying. No matter your age. No matter your past." The crowd erupted in applause. Some stood. Some wiped their eyes. And Frank just smiled. A real one. Big and unafraid. When the crowd cleared and the sun began to set, Frank stood beside the plane, watching the sky turn orange and lavender. Haley came up beside him. "You did it," she said. "We did it," he replied. "Think you'll build another?" she asked. Frank looked at her. "I think I'll always be building something now. Doesn't have to be a plane. Might be a letter. A relationship. Even just a good day." She nodded. "That's a good legacy." He looked at her with deep warmth. "You're part of it, you know." "I know," she said, linking her arm through his. "So, what's next?" Frank watched the sky a long moment. Then he said, "Next, we dream again." And that was the real breakthrough, not the plane, not the followers, not the praise. But the belief that tomorrow still held room for something beautiful. Frank had learned the truth. The finish line wasn't age. The end wasn't when the calendar said so. It was when you stopped believing you mattered. And he knew now. Deep in his chest, in the calluses on his hands, in the sound of his name spoken with respect again, he still mattered. Frank had thought the end of the plane would feel like closure. In many ways, it did. He'd completed something decades in the making, he'd reconnected with Josh, and he'd found an unexpected purpose through Haley and a million strangers on the internet. But as the days stretched out after the fall fest, he discovered something stranger, something deeper. It didn't feel like an ending at all. It felt like the start of something he couldn't yet name. There was no applause in the garage now. No spotlight. Just the familiar smell of wood and metal, and the way the air always hung heavier when the heater hadn't kicked on yet. Frank stood in the center of the space, hands on his hips, staring at the empty workbench. For the first time in weeks, it was clean. Not scrubbed, not polished, just blank. A stage with no play. He felt a flicker of something unsettling, like standing at the edge of a dock after the boat had sailed. "Now what?" he said aloud. Moose looked up from his corner near the old toolbox but offered no insight. Frank scratched his head and wandered to the back wall, where all the old projects had once lived, birdhouses, coat racks, half-finished picture frames that Mary had wanted hung in the hallway. He touched a few of the unfinished ones. They didn't call to him. Not like the plane had. The plane had been different. The plane had held memory and meaning. This was just wood. Still, the urge to create hadn't left him. It pressed behind his ribs like a heartbeat. That's when he remembered a comment from one of the podcast listeners. A retired professor had written, "You should teach others to build what you've built." At the time, Frank had smiled politely and ignored it. But now, alone in the still garage, that idea didn't sound foolish. It sounded like a door. Not a grand one. Not a spaceship hatch like Elon would step through. Just a small, wooden door in his own backyard. He didn't want to be a guru. He wasn't looking to be famous. But maybe, just maybe, he could help someone else start again. The next morning, he brought the idea up to Haley. She was eating cereal in front of her laptop, her hair tied in a messy bun. "What if I taught a class?" he said. She paused, spoon halfway to her mouth. "A class?" "Yeah. A beginner's woodworking thing. Simple stuff. We could do it here or maybe at the community center. Just something to get people building again. Older folks. People like me who think it's too late." Haley set the bowl down. "That's a great idea. You think anyone would come?" "Frank," she said, "people drove from 3 states away just to see your plane at Fall Fest. I think they'd pay attention." Still unsure, Frank reached out to the local community center. They offered him the use of the craft room every Saturday morning. "Start small," the coordinator said. "We'll list it in the newsletter. See who bites." The first week, only 3 people showed up. An elderly widow named Nora who wore thick glasses and smelled like peppermint. A Vietnam vet named Eddie who walked with a cane and had a quiet laugh. And a man named Curtis, 62, recently retired from accounting and visibly nervous holding a hammer. "We're not here to build planes," Frank told them. "We're here to build whatever we want. The only rule is, start." By the end of that first class, Nora had made a crooked but charming flower box. Eddie was halfway through a bird feeder. Curtis just smiled and said, "I didn't break anything." That's a win. Haley filmed the class, edited the footage into a short video, and uploaded it under the title, Frank's Garage, Episode 1, Starting Doesn't Need Permission. Within days, it had 200,000 views. Messages came in from across the country. People wanted to start their own garage groups. One woman in Oregon wrote, "I printed out a flyer and posted it at the library. We're starting our first build night next week." Another man, age 81, sent a photo of himself and his grandson making a bench. "This is our bridge back to each other," the caption read. Frank read these messages slowly, reverently, like sacred text. He wasn't just teaching. He was multiplying something. Hope, maybe. Or momentum. In the weeks that followed, the Saturday classes grew. 7 students, then 12. A local cafe donated coffee and donuts. Someone brought in a boombox and they played old Sinatra records while they worked. People laughed. People cursed. People created. And every Saturday, Frank felt that pulse of life again. The pulse he thought was gone. Then, one rainy Thursday morning, Frank received a letter in the mail. A thick envelope. Handwritten. The return address said, SpaceX, Hawthorne, California. He stared at it for a long minute before opening it. Inside was a short note. Typed. Frank. Your story found its way to me. I admire what you've built, not just with your hands, but with your heart. Building is believing. At any age. Keep going. Elon. Beneath the letter was a signed photo. Not a glossy promo shot, but a candid image of Elon in a workshop, sleeves rolled up, surrounded by engineers. On the back, in pen, he'd written. Never too late to disrupt your own limits. Frank didn't tell anyone about the letter right away. Not even Haley. He didn't want to turn it into a circus. But he placed the photo quietly on the garage wall next to Mary's picture. Side by side, the woman who loved him through every chapter, and the man whose mindset had lit a fire in the final act. He stared at them both for a long time. "Guess I'm not done yet," he whispered. A week later, the local paper ran a feature titled "The Garage That Changed Everything." It showed Frank smiling beside a row of students holding their finished projects. The article talked about legacy, about late-in-life reinvention, about how one man with a plane reminded a town what purpose looked like. Frank cut out the article and mailed a copy to Josh with a sticky note attached. It simply said, "Still building." Josh called the next night. "You're really doing it, huh?" he said. "Trying," Frank replied. "Haley says you're famous now. She's biased." "I'm proud of you, Dad." Frank leaned back in his chair, eyes stinging just a little. "I'm proud of us. Think I could come back for a class sometime?" "Anytime," Frank said. "Anytime at all." That night, Frank sat on the porch again, a blanket over his knees, Moose curled up beside him. The stars above were sharp and clear. He thought about the past. The quiet years. The grief. The slow fade. And he thought about now. About the workbench filled with life. About the people walking back into their own stories because he'd chosen not to stay still. He'd once believed he was too old to change. That it was too late. That his best days were gone. But he was wrong. He was still becoming. Still unfolding. Still reaching forward, even with weathered hands. And that, he now knew, was the real miracle. The question had never been, "Am I too old?" The question had always been, "Am I willing to begin again?" He sipped his cocoa. Listened to the breeze moving through the trees. And he whispered, not to anyone, not for a video, not for a crowd, but just to himself, "I am." Frank woke that morning to the familiar creak of the old house settling. It was quiet except for the ticking clock and the soft hum of the heater. He lay there a moment, feeling the weight of the day ahead, not heavy like it used to be, but full of possibility. The garage was calling him, the smell of sawdust and paint whispering promises he was still learning to hear. Today was the day he would prepare for the biggest workshop yet. The community center had agreed to host a month-long series of classes, and Frank had said yes before he could talk himself out of it. He dressed slowly, savoring the ritual of putting on his worn jeans and flannel shirt, the fabric soft from years of wear. He shuffled to the kitchen where Haley was already making coffee. "Morning, Grandpa," she said with a smile, handing him a steaming mug. "Big day." Frank nodded, feeling the nerves settle like a stone in his stomach. "Feels bigger than anything I've done." Haley leaned over and squeezed his shoulder. "You're ready." He wasn't sure he believed her yet. The thought of standing in front of a room full of strangers, some of whom probably didn't think a man his age had anything to teach, still made his chest tighten. But he remembered Elon's words from the letter, "Never too late to disrupt your own limits." And the echo of that encouragement gave him courage. The first class of the series began at 9 a.m. sharp. Frank arrived early to set up, laying out tools and wood pieces, checking the projector for a short slideshow he'd prepared about his own journey and the philosophy behind building. Chairs filled slowly with familiar faces, some old, some new. Nora and Eddie were there, smiling and supportive. Others came with hesitant eyes and uncertain hands. Frank cleared his throat and started with a story, how he'd spent decades thinking the years were slipping through his fingers, how the plane project had saved him from disappearing into silence, and how building had become a lifeline. The room fell quiet, not out of boredom but respect. When he finished, Frank smiled and said, "Now, let's build something that matters, to you." Over the next few weeks, Frank watched as people transformed before his eyes. People who had long thought their creativity was behind them rediscovered the joy of making. The workshop became a sanctuary, a place of laughter, mistakes, learning, and breakthroughs. Frank kept the tone light but meaningful, encouraging everyone to take risks and embrace imperfection. One day, Curtis brought in a photo album of his old woodworking projects. "I forgot I even had these," he said. "Didn't think I'd ever pick up the tools again." The group pored over the photos, sharing stories and memories. Frank realized then that this wasn't just about building objects, it was about building bridges to forgotten parts of themselves. He thought often about Elon, who had built rockets and cars, dared the impossible, and yet had once been an outsider too. Frank saw in that a mirror for his own fears and hopes. He began to speak more openly about fear, failure, and the power of relentless curiosity. One afternoon, Haley caught Frank tinkering with an idea he called the Legacy Project. Instead of a plane or a box, it was a community-built bench, designed and assembled by everyone who had come through the workshops. "I want this bench to tell a story," he explained. "A story about how we all matter, no matter our age, no matter what we've lost or missed." Haley smiled, excited. "I'll help you organize." As word spread, more people wanted to join. The local hardware store donated supplies. The community center offered more space. Even Josh surprised Frank by volunteering to help with the build. "Thought I'd come learn a thing or two," Josh said with a grin. Frank laughed, grateful for the company. Week by week, the bench took shape. Each plank held the fingerprints and marks of different hands, a mosaic of effort and hope. The day they finished, they unveiled it in the town park. It was rough-hewn but beautiful, a symbol of resilience and connection. Kids climbed on it, elders rested there, and strangers stopped to admire the story behind it. Frank stood beside Haley and Josh, feeling the sun warm his face. He thought about how far he'd come, from feeling useless and invisible to becoming a spark for others. The bench was more than wood, it was a declaration. You are still here. You still matter. Later, Frank received an unexpected invitation, a virtual roundtable with other late bloomers and creators who had been inspired by Elon Musk's mindset. They shared stories of reinvention and daring to start again. Frank listened, spoke, and learned. He realized he wasn't alone. There was a network of people pushing against the limits society put on aging. That evening, he sat on his porch with Moose at his feet, looking at the stars and feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. The journey wasn't over. It never would be. But that was okay. Because Frank understood now that life was less about arriving and more about becoming. The horizon was wide, and he was ready to explore it. Frank never imagined that a simple bench in the town park could become a catalyst for connection in a place where isolation had quietly taken root. After the bench's unveiling, something shifted in the community's rhythm. The park became a meeting place, a pulse point for stories and laughter, where neighbors stopped and lingered, and the old barriers between generations and backgrounds began to crumble. One morning, Frank arrived at the community center with a box of freshly cut wood and a hopeful heart. His Saturday workshop had become more than just a place to build, it was now a sanctuary for people craving purpose and companionship. Frank greeted his students warmly, recognizing familiar faces and new ones who'd heard the word and wanted to try their hand. Among them was Millie, a retired schoolteacher with a warm smile and eyes that held decades of wisdom. She came for the building but stayed for the conversations. "It's the first time I've felt useful in years," she confided during a break, stirring her coffee slowly. "This place, your workshop, it's like a second chance." Frank nodded, feeling the familiar tug in his chest. It was a feeling he knew well, the weight of invisibility, the longing to matter. That day, he shared a story from his past, something he hadn't talked about much, the night Mary passed, and the silence that followed, the emptiness that swallowed him whole. "I thought my story was over," Frank said softly. "But then I found that building something, even if it's just a birdhouse or a bench, was a way to keep writing it." His words hung in the air, a quiet invitation for others to share their own struggles. The group opened up, revealing stories of loss, regret, and hope. Eddie, the Vietnam vet, spoke of loneliness after his wife died. Curtis shared his fears about aging alone. The room became a mosaic of human experience, stitched together by the shared act of creation. Frank thought about Elon Musk, the way he constantly pushed boundaries, refusing to accept limits others set. But Elon wasn't just a man who built rockets. He was a man who believed in relentless reinvention. And Frank realized that reinvention was never just a solo act. It needed connection. The next week, Frank received a surprising call from a local youth center. The director wanted to collaborate, to create an intergenerational workshop where seniors and teens would build projects together. At first, Frank hesitated. The idea of mixing age groups felt risky. What if the kids didn't care? What if the seniors felt out of place? But Haley encouraged him, reminding him of how important bridging gaps could be. So, he said yes. The first session was awkward. Teens shuffled in, headphones slung around necks, skeptical eyes meeting cautious smiles from the seniors. But as the hammer hit nail and the saw carved wood, walls started to fall. One boy, Javier, who had been quiet all morning, suddenly laughed as his project wobbled and nearly collapsed. "It's okay," Frank said, steadying the wood. "We learn by failing." Javier grinned, and soon others joined in, asking questions, sharing ideas. The seniors told stories of their youth, the teens shared hopes for the future. Frank watched it all unfold, heart swelling. It was messy, imperfect, but it was alive. In the weeks that followed, the intergenerational workshop became the highlight of the week for many. Stories flowed as freely as the sawdust. One afternoon, Eddie shared photos from his military days, sparking conversations about sacrifice and resilience. Millie helped a shy teenager named Sam write a letter to his estranged father. Curtis told jokes that had the room roaring. And Frank? He was the steady thread weaving them together. He had gone from feeling useless to becoming a keeper of stories, a maker of spaces where healing could happen. Through it all, Elon Musk's presence lingered, not as a savior, but as a symbol of fearless reinvention. Frank thought often about one of Elon's interviews where he said, "Some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster." Frank didn't want disaster. He wanted growth. He wanted connection. One day, as the workshop wrapped up, a woman approached Frank. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, eyes glistening. "My mother hasn't spoken much since Dad passed, but she comes here every week now. This place, it's helped her come back." Frank felt a lump rise in his throat. That was the moment he understood his work wasn't just about building things. It was about rebuilding lives. About reminding people they still mattered. Later that evening, Frank sat on his porch with Moose and Haley, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and lavender. Haley nudged him gently. "You've changed a lot since the plane." Frank smiled, the lines on his face deepening. "I think I'm still changing." Haley laughed. "Good. Because the world needs people like you." Frank looked up at the stars just beginning to twinkle. He thought about the long road behind him and the uncertain path ahead. He thought about Elon's letter, the bench, the workshops, and the people who had come to trust him. He realized that his journey was less about finishing and more about becoming a source of hope and light for others. And that made all the difference. The next morning, Frank woke with a plan forming in his mind. There were more projects to build, more stories to hear, and more people waiting to find their spark. The horizon was wide and welcoming. And Frank was ready to keep walking forward. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank had never been a man who welcomed failure. For most of his life, mistakes felt like proof of weakness, proof that time was running out, that he wasn't good enough anymore. But now, as he sat in the garage surrounded by sawdust, broken scraps of wood, and a few half-finished projects, he was learning something new: failure wasn't the end. It was a beginning. The latest project was a simple wooden birdhouse. It should have been easy, but the nails bent, the wood split, and Frank's fingers fumbled the hammer more than once. For the first time in a long time, he laughed, deep, genuine laughter that echoed off the walls and shook loose years of self-doubt. "Well," he muttered, "guess I'm still figuring things out." Haley, watching from the doorway, smiled. "That's the best kind of learning." It reminded Frank of a quote from Elon Musk that had stuck with him: "Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." The words echoed in his mind as he cleaned up the mess and started again. Frank's willingness to fail, to try and try again, became contagious. His workshops encouraged it, and the community responded. People who were afraid to pick up tools before now embraced the idea that making mistakes was part of the process, not a sign of defeat but a step toward mastery. One day, Nora brought in a crooked chair she'd made during class. It wobbled dangerously but had character, like a reminder that perfection wasn't the goal. She said, "It's not perfect, but it's mine." Frank nodded, thinking about how much that sentiment mirrored his own journey. But failure wasn't just about wood and nails. It was about the bigger risks Frank was taking, the emotional ones. Reaching out to Josh had been a gamble, uncertain and messy. Opening up in his workshops had left him vulnerable. Even accepting Elon's letter, knowing it might bring attention or criticism, was a risk. Yet, through all that, Frank found freedom, the freedom to be imperfect, to be human. One afternoon, after class, Curtis lingered behind. "Frank," he said, "I never thought I'd say this, but I think I'm starting to like failing." Frank laughed. "It's the best teacher you'll ever have." Curtis smiled shyly. "You've taught me more than just woodworking. You've taught me to be okay with not being okay." The conversation stayed with Frank long after Curtis left. It was proof that change wasn't just about building projects, it was about building character. Frank's growing community began to share their own stories of failure and resilience. They started a tradition during workshops called Fail Forward Fridays, where everyone shared a recent failure and what it taught them. It became a sacred space, where judgment disappeared and courage grew. Even Haley joined in, sharing her struggles with feeling overwhelmed as a young caregiver balancing her career and family. The more Frank listened, the more he understood, failure was a universal thread that connected them all. Meanwhile, Frank's relationship with Josh continued to evolve. They talked more frequently, their conversations moving from cautious to candid. Josh admitted his own fears about the future, his worries about living up to expectations and finding purpose after retirement. Frank shared his own doubts, creating a bond of honesty neither had expected. One evening, Josh surprised Frank with a visit, bringing his daughter along to meet the grandfather she'd only heard stories about. Frank held his granddaughter for the first time, feeling the sharp joy of connection and legacy in her tiny fingers. It was a moment that grounded him, reminding him of the importance of embracing every chance to build relationships, even if it meant risking hurt. With each new connection, Frank's perspective on aging shifted. He began to see it not as a decline but as a season ripe with possibility, a time to create, to teach, to learn, to fail, and to love more deeply than ever before. The past no longer felt like a weight dragging him down but a foundation supporting the new life he was building. Elon's rebellious spirit had ignited something inside him, not just the courage to build planes or benches, but the bravery to embrace all parts of himself, flaws and all. That winter, as snow blanketed the town, Frank organized a special project. A community sled built by seniors and teens alike. It was a symbol of joy, of moving forward together, no matter the obstacles. The workshop buzzed with energy as everyone chipped in, laughing through mistakes and celebrating small victories. When the sled was finished, they took it to the hill near the school, and for the first time in years, Frank joined in the laughter of children as they raced down the slope, the cold air biting but the spirit warm. That night, as he warmed his hands by the fire, Frank thought about how far he'd come from the man who felt useless at 67. The garage was no longer a place of solitude but a hub of life, learning, and community. The mistakes, the failures, they had become the seeds of freedom. He realized that the real transformation wasn't just about building things, it was about building a new mindset. One where age was not a limit but a challenge to be met with curiosity and courage. Frank pulled out the letter from Elon Musk, rereading the words that had meant so much. He smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude. The letter wasn't just encouragement, it was a call to action, a reminder that the fire of invention and reinvention burns at every age. Frank wasn't just building birdhouses and benches. He was building a life that mattered, a life that inspired. And in doing so, he was proving to himself, and to everyone watching, that it's never too late to begin again. Frank's mornings began to take on a new rhythm. He no longer woke up weighed down by the shadows of what he thought he had lost. Instead, he found himself eager to greet the day, fueled by a sense of purpose that pulsed quietly but steadily beneath his skin. The garage workshop had become more than a place for projects, it was now a haven of possibility where past regrets were being chipped away, replaced by fresh hopes and ambitions. One chilly spring morning, Frank sat at his workbench with a fresh block of wood before him, fingers tracing the grain thoughtfully. This time, the project wasn't just a birdhouse or a bench, it was something he called the memory box, a simple wooden container designed to hold mementos, letters, photographs, tokens of a life well lived and still unfolding. Frank wanted the box to be a vessel of stories, a way for people to preserve and share their legacies, no matter their age. As he shaped the wood, memories flooded in, of Mary's smile, the laughter of his children when they were young, the bittersweet silence after they grew distant. The box became a symbol not only for the workshop but for Frank's own healing. The act of creating something meant to carry memories felt like reclaiming parts of himself that time had tried to erode. Word of the memory box project spread quickly through the town, and soon Frank was teaching it at his workshops. He encouraged participants to bring in photos or objects that told their stories. Millie, who had become one of his closest friends in the group, brought an old scarf knitted by her mother. Eddie shared a faded letter from a wartime comrade. The community center filled with these intimate treasures, each memory box a capsule of history and hope. Frank's role evolved beyond teacher to storyteller and keeper of legacies. He helped people find the courage to speak about their pasts, the triumphs, the failures, the love, and the loss. One afternoon, Curtis brought in a letter he had written to his estranged son but had never sent. With Frank's gentle encouragement, Curtis read it aloud to the group. The room held its breath as his voice cracked with emotion. When he finished, a silence lingered before soft applause broke out. Frank saw how much healing could come from simply being heard. Meanwhile, Frank's relationship with Josh deepened. The initial awkwardness gave way to moments of genuine connection, laughter, and sometimes, difficult conversations. Josh opened up about his struggles with regret and the pressure of living up to family expectations. Frank shared his own fears about mortality and the desire to leave something meaningful behind. They began collaborating on projects, merging Josh's technical skills with Frank's craftsmanship. Together, they started working on a small solar-powered bench for the park, a nod to Elon Musk's vision of sustainable innovation. One evening, after a long day in the workshop, Josh confided, "I never thought I'd find this with you, Dad. I was so lost." Frank's heart tightened. "Neither did I," he admitted. "But it's never too late to start again." The bench project became a symbol of their rebuilding relationship and a testament to the power of purpose to heal old wounds. Local newspapers caught wind of the story, and soon Frank found himself the subject of a feature article titled, "The Man Who Proves It's Never Too Late." The article brought new faces to his workshops and sparked conversations about aging, resilience, and reinvention in communities beyond his own. Despite the attention, Frank stayed grounded. He knew his work wasn't about fame but about connection and growth. He began journaling daily, capturing his thoughts, fears, and hopes. His writing became a tool for reflection, helping him navigate the ups and downs of change. One morning, as he sat with his coffee on the porch, Haley handed him a small envelope. Inside was a letter from a woman named Grace, who had attended one of his workshops after reading the article. She wrote about how Frank's story had inspired her to reconnect with her estranged mother and to start volunteering at a local senior center. The letter ended with, "Thank you for showing me it's never too late to heal." Frank felt a surge of gratitude and renewed commitment. His journey had become part of something larger, a ripple effect touching lives he might never meet. That spring, the community center organized a Legacy Day event where workshop participants shared their memory boxes and stories. The room was filled with laughter, tears, and the warmth of shared humanity. Frank stood at the front, watching as people celebrated each other's journeys. He realized that reclaiming purpose wasn't a solitary act but a collective movement. As the sun set that day, Frank walked home feeling lighter than he had in years. The future was still uncertain, but it no longer scared him. He was no longer defined by what he'd lost but by the purpose he was reclaiming with every breath, every project, every story told. He thought about Elon Musk and his fearless pursuit of the impossible. Frank knew he might never build rockets or change the world on a global scale, but in his own small way, he was disrupting the narrative of aging. He was proving that purpose could be found, rebuilt, and expanded at any stage of life. Frank smiled as he looked at Moose lying beside his chair, the dog's steady presence a reminder of the simple joys often overlooked. The journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Frank felt ready, not just to face the future but to shape it. Frank sat quietly in his favorite armchair, the soft hum of the evening settling around him like a comforting blanket. Outside, the sky was a deep indigo, flecked with stars that seemed to pulse with possibility. He stared at the small notebook in his hands, a journal filled with thoughts, sketches, and plans. Every page marked a step forward in a journey that had once felt impossible to begin. For decades, Frank's life had been a series of routines: wake, work, come home, sleep, all underscored by a quiet ache of regret and a slow erosion of hope. At 67, he had felt trapped in a cage of invisibility, convinced that his best days were behind him. But something had changed. One small step, a letter from Elon Musk, had shattered the illusion that it was too late. That step had led to another, then another, until now Frank was standing in a place he never thought he'd reach: purpose, connection, and the thrill of ongoing reinvention. He thought about how Elon had said, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Those words had been a spark that set his soul alight. The odds had seemed stacked against him, but Frank realized that the most important thing was just to begin, to take that single step, no matter how small. The garage workshop was quiet now, but earlier that day it had buzzed with life and laughter. Seniors and teens had worked side by side, sharing stories and swapping skills. Together, they had crafted another memory box, each one unique and filled with meaning. Frank had watched as a shy teenager named Lily proudly presented her box, filled with letters to her late grandmother. The pride on her face mirrored his own from years past when he'd first learned to build something tangible. It was a reminder that progress didn't have to be monumental, it just had to be genuine. That evening, Frank reflected on the power of momentum. He realized that every large transformation started with a single, sometimes hesitant step. It wasn't about leaping tall buildings or reinventing oneself overnight. It was about the courage to start, to choose action over fear. Frank had learned to accept discomfort as a sign of growth. The awkward first meetings with Josh, the stumbles in his workshop, the difficult conversations with old friends, each had felt like a mountain to climb. But each step had built strength and opened new doors. He remembered the first time he had shared his story publicly. His hands had trembled as he read his words aloud at the community center. The silence that followed had felt like a verdict, but then people stood and applauded. That moment had taught him the value of vulnerability, that sharing our truths can be a beacon for others lost in the dark. Frank's mind drifted to his own father, a man of few words and rigid expectations. Frank had spent years trying to live up to standards that never felt quite reachable, and it had cost him precious years of connection. Now, with Josh, Frank was learning a different way, one grounded in honesty, patience, and the willingness to begin again, no matter the past. He thought about the bench in the park, now weathered but standing strong, a symbol of resilience and community. It wasn't a grand monument, but it was enough, a place where people sat, talked, and healed. Frank had realized that legacy isn't built in fame or fortune, but in the small acts of kindness and courage that ripple outward. A knock at the door pulled Frank from his reverie. It was Haley, holding a box of supplies for tomorrow's workshop. "Still thinking too much?" she teased gently. Frank chuckled. "Maybe a little. But that's part of it." Haley smiled knowingly. "That's what makes you you. And what makes this place special." They sat together in the warm light of the kitchen, planning the next project, a collaborative mural celebrating stories of aging and transformation. Frank loved the idea. It was another way to give voice to experiences often overlooked. As the night deepened, Frank felt a quiet peace settle over him. The future was still uncertain, but it no longer held the terror it once did. He understood now that the path forward was paved with the steps he chose to take each day, imperfect, brave, and real. He closed his notebook and looked out the window at the stars once more. Somewhere out there, Elon Musk was launching rockets into the sky, chasing dreams that seemed impossible. Frank was no Elon, but he didn't need to be. He had found his own mission, one of connection, creativity, and hope. With a deep breath, Frank whispered to the night, "I'm ready for the next step." Frank had come to realize that his journey was no longer a solitary one. The transformation that had begun in his quiet garage was spreading, weaving its way through the fabric of the small town that had once seemed indifferent to its aging population. What started as a personal quest for meaning had blossomed into a shared movement of hope, connection, and purpose. On a bright Saturday morning, Frank arrived early at the community center, the familiar scent of coffee and fresh paint greeting him like an old friend. The room was already buzzing with energy. Volunteers, mostly seniors, but also a few younger faces, were setting up tables for the day's workshop. Today was special. They were launching the Legacy Project, an initiative Frank had helped organize, designed to bring people together to create stories, art, and memories that honored their pasts and embraced their futures. Frank's heart swelled as he looked around. Here were faces marked by lines of time but lit by eyes filled with curiosity and determination. There was Millie, proudly clutching a photo album she had painstakingly restored. Curtis, steady and focused, was arranging a collection of letters he planned to share. Haley, juggling her caregiver duties with a radiant smile, greeted Frank warmly. Even Josh had come, a quiet support beside his father. As the morning unfolded, Frank guided participants through storytelling exercises. He encouraged them to share moments that shaped them, their triumphs, their losses, their dreams deferred or realized. The room echoed with laughter, tears, and the hum of conversations that bridged generations. Frank watched as barriers crumbled and connections flourished. He understood now that community was more than a collection of individuals, it was a living, breathing source of strength. At one point, a young woman named Sarah hesitated before sharing a story about her grandmother, who had passed away the previous year. Her voice trembled, but as Frank nodded encouragingly, she found courage. Sarah's story sparked memories from others, weaving a tapestry of shared experiences. It was a reminder that even in loss, there was a powerful thread of continuity. Frank recalled a podcast he'd recently heard where Elon Musk spoke about the importance of building teams and communities to achieve what no one person could do alone. "If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together," Elon had said. Frank felt that truth deeply. His own path to rediscovery had been bolstered by the people who showed up, not just physically but with open hearts. The afternoon brought a surprise visit from the local mayor, who praised the Legacy Project as a model for other towns grappling with aging populations. News crews arrived, capturing footage of seniors and teens collaborating on art installations and sharing stories. Frank realized this attention was a double-edged sword. While it brought awareness and resources, it also made him vulnerable to scrutiny. Yet, he welcomed it because the message was bigger than him. Later, as the event wound down, Frank found a quiet moment outside with Josh. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows, and the two men sat on a bench they had built together. Josh broke the silence. "Dad, I've been thinking. Maybe this is more than just a hobby or a project. Maybe this is what we're meant to do." Frank smiled, feeling the weight of years of silence and misunderstanding melt away. "I think you're right," he said softly. That evening, Frank sat by the fire, reflecting on how far the community had come. He thought about the fear he once felt, that he was invisible, irrelevant, a relic of a bygone era. Now, surrounded by friends, family, and neighbors, he felt seen and valued. The power of community had given him not just purpose, but belonging. He realized that aging didn't mean fading away, it meant deepening roots and branching out in new directions. With every story shared, every project completed, the town was rewriting its own narrative, one that celebrated resilience, creativity, and the unbreakable human spirit. Frank looked at his hands, rough and worn but steady, and whispered a quiet thanks to the journey that had brought him here. It wasn't just about changing one thing in his life, it was about changing everything, the way he saw himself and the world around him. Frank woke before dawn, the cool morning air slipping through the cracked window of his bedroom, carrying the soft scent of pine and earth. The world outside was quiet, but inside him, a restless energy stirred. A feeling he hadn't experienced in years. This was the first day of a new chapter, and the weight of that truth pressed gently but firmly on his chest. The Legacy Project had become more than a community effort, it was now a beacon of possibility, a movement that gave voice to those who had long been silenced by time and circumstance. Yet, despite the success, Frank felt a tug deep inside, a yearning for something more, a challenge that would stretch him beyond the comfortable rhythm of workshops and storytelling sessions. He thought back to Elon Musk's words, "Persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up." Frank had come to understand persistence not as stubbornness, but as a quiet, steady refusal to let fear dictate his path. But now, he wondered if he had the courage to take the next step, the leap from comfort into the unknown. That morning, as sunlight spilled across the wooden floor, Frank made a decision. He would propose a bold new initiative, a multi-generational innovation lab that combined the creativity and experience of seniors with the technological savvy of youth. It would be a place where ideas flowed freely, where age was a strength, and where solutions for real-world problems were born from collaboration. The idea felt ambitious, almost overwhelming. But Frank knew that growth required risk. If Elon could chase rockets and electric cars despite countless setbacks, why couldn't he chase his own dreams, even if they seemed small by comparison? At the community center, Frank presented the concept to the Legacy Project team. Faces lit up with excitement and cautious optimism. Millie, ever the organizer, offered to help secure funding. Curtis suggested reaching out to local schools for partnerships. Haley promised to rally volunteers. Even Josh, quieter than usual, spoke up with ideas for incorporating sustainable technology. The room buzzed with possibility. For the first time, Frank sensed a collective energy that transcended age, background, and past regrets. This was more than a project, it was a movement toward rebirth, not just for individuals but for the entire community. Over the next weeks, Frank poured himself into the work. He balanced paperwork and meetings with hands-on sessions in the workshop. He faced skepticism and bureaucratic delays, moments that tested his resolve. But each setback was met with renewed determination, a testament to the lessons he had learned about resilience. One afternoon, as Frank helped a group of teens solder components for a solar-powered device, he caught a glimpse of himself in the reflection of a dusty window. The man staring back was older, sure, but alive, vibrant, engaged. He was no longer the man who had felt useless at 67. He was a man reborn. The Innovation Lab opened to great fanfare, attracting attention from nearby towns and even a few regional media outlets. The projects ranged from simple inventions to community improvements, a rainwater harvesting system, a digital archive of local history, an app connecting seniors with volunteer companions. Frank watched as seniors and teens worked side by side, sharing skills and stories. The barriers between generations dissolved, replaced by mutual respect and shared purpose. The lab became a sanctuary where creativity flowed, and the wisdom of years met the energy of youth in a dance of innovation. One evening, after a long day of work, Frank sat with Josh on the lab's porch. The air was warm, filled with the hum of cicadas and distant laughter. Josh looked at his father with a quiet pride. "Dad, this place, it's incredible. You've built something real." Frank smiled, feeling the depth of that moment. "It's not just me, Josh. It's all of us. And it's just the beginning." The rebirth of hope was more than a personal triumph, it was a shared victory, a testament to what was possible when people refused to let age define their limits. Frank knew the road ahead would have challenges. There would be days of doubt and fatigue. But he also knew that the spark Elon Musk had ignited within him had become a steady flame, one that would guide him through whatever came next. As the stars emerged in the night sky, Frank felt a profound sense of peace. He was not just living out his years, he was living out his purpose. And that made all the difference. Frank had learned that change was the only constant, yet embracing it remained one of the hardest lessons he faced. At first, the thought of shaking up decades of habits and beliefs filled him with anxiety. How do you rewrite a story written in a lifetime? How do you step into an unknown version of yourself when the past clings like a shadow? But through every project, every conversation, every moment of vulnerability, Frank had begun to see that change wasn't a thief but a gift, a chance to rediscover what truly mattered. The Innovation Lab had become a crucible for transformation, not just for the community but for Frank himself. He was no longer the man who felt too old to matter. He was someone who could adapt, learn, and grow alongside the younger generation, proving that age was a resource, not a limitation. He saw it in the eyes of the teens who looked to him for guidance, and in the smiles of seniors who had found new purpose. Change was happening, and it was beautiful. That spring afternoon, Frank found himself walking through the town park, the bench he and Josh had built gleaming in the golden sunlight. Moose padded happily at his side, sniffing the fresh blooms. The air smelled of earth and possibility. Frank stopped to watch a group of children laughing near the playground, their carefree joy a reminder of the cycles of life and the endless potential to begin anew. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Haley, inviting him to a community panel discussing aging and technology. Frank hesitated. Public speaking had once filled him with dread, but he knew this was another step forward. He replied with a yes, deciding to face his fears head-on. On the day of the panel, Frank stood backstage with other speakers, feeling the familiar flutter of nerves. But then he thought of Elon Musk, who had faced countless skeptics and failures yet pressed on. If Elon could confront the unknown to change the world, Frank could share his story to change perceptions about aging. When it was his turn, Frank walked to the podium and looked out at the crowd, a mix of young, old, curious, and doubtful faces. He spoke honestly about his fears, his regrets, and the spark that had ignited his journey. He talked about the power of taking one step, the importance of community, and the refusal to let age define worth. His voice wavered at times, but his message was clear: it is never too late to change, to grow, and to find purpose. The room responded with applause and tears. Afterwards, several people approached Frank, sharing their own stories and thanking him for his courage. A young woman named Mia, who cared for her aging grandmother, told Frank that his words had given her hope to pursue her own dreams without guilt. Frank realized then that embracing change was not about denying the past but honoring it while boldly stepping into the future. It was about being brave enough to be vulnerable and open to new possibilities. That night, back at home, Frank sat by the fire with Josh and Haley, recounting the panel experience. They laughed, shared stories, and dreamed aloud about the future of the Innovation Lab and beyond. Frank felt a profound sense of belonging, knowing that the bonds forged through shared change were stronger than any fear. He thought about the road behind him, the loneliness, the doubts, the moments he had almost given up. But he also thought about the road ahead, wide open and full of promise. The journey was far from over, but Frank was ready. He was living proof that change could lead to growth, connection, and a life rich with meaning. As he closed his eyes that night, Frank whispered a quiet gratitude to the spark that had started it all, a simple idea from Elon Musk that had transformed his world and given him permission to matter again. Frank's life had shifted in ways he never expected. What began as a fragile hope had grown into a driving mission that filled his days with meaning and purpose. The innovation lab was thriving, but Frank knew his journey was still unfolding. The spark Elon Musk had lit was not a one-time blaze, it was a flame to be nurtured, fed by vision, courage, and relentless action. One crisp autumn morning, Frank woke with a sense of anticipation. Today was the day he would pitch a new idea to the town council, a proposal for a senior-led tech mentorship program aimed at connecting retirees with local businesses struggling to adapt to digital demands. The idea had come from many conversations, moments of reflection, and a growing awareness that experience and technology could be powerful allies, not adversaries. Frank dressed carefully and rehearsed his pitch as he walked the familiar route to the town hall. The building stood solid and imposing, a symbol of tradition that sometimes felt resistant to change. Yet Frank felt ready to face the challenge. His nervousness was tempered by the memory of Elon Musk's boldness, the way Elon pursued ideas others dismissed as impossible. Inside, the council chamber was abuzz with chatter. Frank's supporters from the Legacy Project and the Innovation Lab filled the seats, their presence a comforting reminder that he was not alone. When it was his turn, Frank stood and began. His voice was steady, infused with passion and clarity as he laid out the vision, a program that would empower seniors to share their skills, help small businesses innovate, and bridge generational divides. The room listened. Questions came, some skeptical, others curious. Frank answered honestly, acknowledging challenges but emphasizing opportunity. He spoke of resilience, of breaking stereotypes, and the untapped potential of a community united by purpose. After what felt like hours, the council voted. The proposal passed by a narrow margin. Relief and joy flooded Frank's heart. This was more than a win, it was a statement that the town was ready to embrace change, led by those it had long overlooked. In the weeks that followed, Frank threw himself into organizing the mentorship program. He worked tirelessly, coordinating with businesses, recruiting seniors eager to contribute, and designing workshops that balanced technology training with confidence building. The energy was infectious. One afternoon, Frank visited a local bakery where an elderly woman named Ruth had agreed to be a mentor. Ruth was soft-spoken but sharp, a retired schoolteacher with a knack for patience. Together, they helped the bakery owner set up an online ordering system, transforming the business and expanding its reach. Frank watched as Ruth explained the steps with gentle encouragement, her eyes shining with pride. It was moments like these that reminded him why this mission mattered, not just for economic survival, but for restoring dignity and connection. The mentorship program quickly became a model of success. Local media covered stories of seniors revitalizing businesses, and other towns expressed interest in replicating the initiative. Frank found himself invited to speak at conferences and community gatherings, sharing the lessons he'd learned about aging, innovation, and the power of one step. Despite the accolades, Frank remained grounded. He knew this was only the beginning, and the real work was building lasting change, shifting mindsets as much as systems. One evening, after a long day, Frank sat with Josh on the porch, watching the stars blink awake. Josh handed him a cup of tea and smiled. "Dad, you've come so far. It's inspiring." Frank nodded, feeling the fullness of that moment. "I've learned that it's never too late. That we're all capable of more than we think, if we're willing to try." He thought back to the man he had been just a few years ago, the man who felt useless, forgotten, and stuck. The journey had been hard, filled with doubt and setbacks, but it had led to this, a life reborn through action, connection, and the courage to change. Frank knew the road ahead would hold new challenges, but now he faced them with a heart steady and full. The mission was clear: to keep moving forward, to keep inspiring, to keep proving that age was not a barrier but a bridge to new possibilities. With a deep breath, Frank whispered into the night, "This is just the beginning." Frank's days had settled into a rhythm of purpose and momentum. The mentorship program flourished, and the innovation lab continued to be a hub of creativity and connection. Yet beneath the surface of activity, Frank felt a deeper shift taking place, a growing awareness that true transformation wasn't just about projects or accolades, but about finding meaning in every moment, no matter how small. One rainy afternoon, Frank sat alone in his garage workshop, the place where his journey had begun. Tools hung neatly on the walls, half-finished projects resting on the workbench. Outside, the steady drizzle pattered against the windows, a soothing soundtrack to his thoughts. He reflected on how far he'd come, from a place of despair to a place of hope, and realized the journey wasn't about proving anything to others, but about reclaiming his own sense of worth. He thought back to Elon Musk's belief that, when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. For Frank, the odds had seemed stacked against him for decades. Age, loss, missed opportunities. But he had chosen to fight anyway, driven by a purpose that transcended fear and doubt. That evening, Frank joined a small gathering at the community center, a group formed to support seniors struggling with loneliness and isolation. The room was warm and inviting, filled with gentle voices and honest stories. Frank listened as others shared their struggles and triumphs, feeling the invisible threads of connection weaving them together. When it was his turn, Frank spoke not as a mentor but as a fellow traveler. He shared the story of his own struggles, the moment he had felt useless at 67, and the small changes that had reignited his life. He spoke of the power of purpose, not as some abstract ideal but as a daily commitment to keep moving forward, to keep finding reasons to matter. The group responded with gratitude and encouragement. One woman, Eleanor, told Frank that his story gave her hope to try again, to reach out and reconnect with estranged family. Another man, David, said he was inspired to start volunteering at the local library. Frank felt a swell of emotion. This was the heart of his journey, the human connection that made every challenge worthwhile. Purpose wasn't just a grand mission, it was the simple act of showing up, of caring, of believing in the possibility of change. In the days that followed, Frank noticed how his own sense of purpose energized every interaction. Whether helping a neighbor with technology, mentoring a young entrepreneur, or simply sharing a smile, he felt a renewed vitality that came from living with intention. One afternoon, as Frank helped Josh prepare for a presentation at the Innovation Lab, he realized how much he had changed. Josh, once distant and skeptical, now looked to his father as a role model and partner. Their relationship had healed and grown, a testament to the power of openness and effort. Frank remembered the early days of his journey, the isolation, the fear, the feeling that time was running out. Now, time felt expansive, full of possibility. He understood that purpose was not something to be found, it was something to be created, nurtured, and shared. That night, Frank sat by the fire, moose curled at his feet, and reflected on a quote he had recently heard from Elon Musk: "The first step is to establish that something is possible, then probability will occur." Frank smiled, knowing that his first step had been the hardest but also the most important. He whispered to himself, "I am possible." Frank sat at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the evening filling the room like a familiar melody. Outside, the sky faded from amber to deep blue, and the distant call of a night bird echoed through the quiet streets of Maplewood. It was a peaceful moment, but inside, Frank's mind was anything but calm. He was standing at a crossroads, one that demanded courage and clarity. The mentorship program was thriving, the innovation lab bustling with ideas, and the community had embraced the new energy he helped ignite. But with growth came new challenges, difficult choices that threatened to test everything he'd built. The town council had approached him with a proposal to expand the program beyond Maplewood, to other neighboring communities. It was a tremendous opportunity, but also a daunting responsibility. Frank wasn't sure he was ready. Doubt crept in, whispering fears that had once consumed him. Was he too old to lead such a big leap? Could he handle the pressure? Would this new chapter drain him of the joy he had fought so hard to rediscover? He thought back to the beginning, the moment he felt utterly useless at 67, the spark from Elon Musk that had changed his path. Elon's relentless pursuit of audacious goals, despite setbacks and naysayers, was a powerful example. When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor, Elon had said. Frank realized that this moment was his test. That night, Frank called Haley and Josh. Together, they talked through the possibilities and fears, weighing the risks and rewards. Haley, ever practical and insightful, reminded him that growth always comes with discomfort, but that discomfort often signals progress. Josh, who had witnessed his father's transformation firsthand, expressed unwavering belief in Frank's ability to lead. Their words anchored Frank, giving him the courage to decide, he would accept the challenge. He would trust the journey, knowing that he didn't have to have all the answers, only the willingness to take the next step. Over the following weeks, Frank threw himself into planning the expansion. He connected with leaders in nearby towns, gathered a team of passionate volunteers, and crafted a vision that honored the spirit of the original program while embracing new possibilities. The work was exhausting but exhilarating. Every obstacle was met with persistence, every doubt confronted with hope. One afternoon, Frank found himself speaking to a room full of seniors in a neighboring town. As he shared his story, the fears, the failures, the moments of triumph, the audience listened intently. Many nodded in recognition, seeing their own struggles reflected in his journey. Frank's voice carried the weight of experience and the lightness of newfound purpose. Afterward, an elderly man approached him, tears in his eyes. "You gave me hope," he said simply. "Hope that it's never too late." Frank felt a deep swell of emotion. This was why he had taken the leap. Not for recognition, but to touch lives, to spark change. The courage to face the unknown had opened doors not just for him, but for others who had long been waiting for permission to dream again. That night, as Frank returned home, Moose bounding happily beside him, he looked up at the stars shining brightly overhead. The path ahead was still uncertain, filled with challenges and surprises. But Frank had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was the choice to move forward despite it. He whispered into the night, "This is my time. My purpose." Frank woke before dawn, the house still wrapped in silence. Outside, a soft breeze stirred the leaves, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. He sat by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the horizon blush with the first light of morning. It was a peaceful moment, but his mind raced with memories and hopes, a tapestry woven from the years of struggle and the unexpected journey that had changed his life. He thought of the man he had been, the shadows of doubt that once clouded every thought. He remembered the nights of loneliness, the sting of feeling forgotten, and the crushing weight of regret. Yet here he was now, not only alive but thriving, a beacon for others who had felt the same despair. The Innovation Lab was humming with activity, and the mentorship program had blossomed beyond Maplewood, touching towns and hearts far and wide. Frank had become more than a participant in his own story, he was a guide, a symbol of what was possible when one dared to defy age and expectation. One memory stood out, the day he first heard Elon Musk's words about fearlessness and radical thinking. Those words had been a spark, a key that unlocked a door Frank thought was sealed forever. Elon, with his audacity and vision, had shown Frank that limits were often illusions waiting to be shattered. Frank's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Haley, carrying a stack of letters and photographs from seniors who had been inspired by the program. She smiled warmly and sat beside him, sharing stories of lives changed, reconnections made, skills discovered, confidence rebuilt. Frank felt a swell of gratitude. The journey had not been easy, but it had been worth every step. He realized that his legacy was not just the projects or programs he helped create, but the light he had helped kindle in others, a light that would continue to shine long after he was gone. Later that day, Frank attended a community celebration honoring the mentorship program's impact. The town square was alive with music, laughter, and stories. As Frank took the stage to speak, he looked out at the faces of young and old, united by hope and purpose. He spoke with a quiet strength, sharing his journey from despair to empowerment. He reminded everyone that age was not a cage but a canvas, that the power to change lived within each of them. His words carried the weight of lived experience and the promise of new beginnings. After the speech, a young woman approached him, eyes bright with tears. "Thank you for showing me it's never too late to chase my dreams," she said. Frank smiled, knowing that this was the true reward. That night, as Frank lay in bed, he felt a deep peace settle over him. He understood now that life was not about the years counted, but the moments lived fully. The legacy he would leave was one of courage, connection, and the relentless belief that we all have the power to change our story. He whispered softly, "I was never too old. I was just waiting to shine." Frank stood at the edge of the town square, the autumn breeze tugging gently at his jacket as he watched families, friends, and neighbors gather for the annual harvest festival. The air was filled with the scent of apple cider, wood smoke, and the laughter of children playing nearby. It was a scene he'd passed by many times before, but today, it felt different, alive with possibility, a celebration not just of the season, but of life itself. He thought back to that moment, years ago, when he had sat alone in his dimly lit kitchen, overwhelmed by the crushing feeling of uselessness and isolation. At 67, Frank had believed his best days were behind him. He had felt invisible, as though time had slipped through his fingers like sand, leaving him empty and forgotten. But then, like a bolt of lightning from a clear sky, a simple phrase from Elon Musk had jolted him awake: "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." That phrase had planted a seed, a small spark that grew into a fierce fire, pushing him to take that first shaky step outside his comfort zone. From that day forward, Frank's life was never the same. He had discovered that age was not a prison but a portal, a gateway to new adventures, connections, and purposes. The journey was difficult, often frightening, but it was also filled with moments of unexpected joy and transformation. Frank smiled as he watched his daughter Haley hand a hot cup of cocoa to an elderly neighbor, her eyes glowing with warmth and pride. Nearby, Josh was helping a group of teenagers set up a digital art exhibit at the community center, a project born from the innovation lab Frank had helped build. Moose trotted over, tail wagging, and nudged Frank's hand for attention. He bent down to scratch behind Moose's ears, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath his fingertips. The mentorship program Frank had launched had grown into a movement, spreading to nearby towns and inspiring countless seniors to reclaim their power and passions. The stories he heard, of friendships rekindled, skills learned, dreams pursued, filled him with gratitude and awe. He had become part of a legacy far bigger than himself, a living testament to the truth that it's never too late to change. That evening, Frank stood before the gathered crowd as the festival lights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the faces around him. The mayor introduced him as the keynote speaker, a man whose courage and vision had transformed the community. As Frank stepped up to the microphone, he felt a familiar flutter in his chest, a mix of nerves and excitement. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice steady and full of heart. He told the story of his darkest days, the doubts that had threatened to swallow him whole, and the one choice that changed everything, the decision to act despite fear, to believe in himself when no one else seemed to. He spoke of Elon Musk not as a savior but as a symbol of radical possibility, a reminder that defying limits was an act of rebellion and hope. Frank's words resonated deeply. He urged everyone to see their own lives as stories still being written, to embrace change as a friend, not a foe. He encouraged the crowd to take small steps, a call to action that didn't require grand gestures but consistent courage. As he finished, the crowd erupted in applause, some wiping tears from their eyes. Frank stepped down from the stage, feeling a profound sense of peace. He had come full circle, from despair to purpose, from invisibility to impact. Later that night, Frank sat on his porch with Haley and Josh, the stars twinkling above like scattered diamonds. They talked about dreams yet to chase and challenges yet to face, bound by the knowledge that the future was theirs to shape. Frank looked up at the sky, a smile tugging at his lips. "I was never too old," he said softly. "I was just waiting for permission to matter again." And in that quiet moment, with the world stretching out before him, Frank knew the greatest adventure was still ahead. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?